You know, after more than 40 years on this bench, I've learned that some moments don't announce themselves with noise. They arrive quietly, almost politely, and if you're not paying attention, you can miss them. The morning an elderly man shuffled into my courtroom carrying a thin plastic grocery bag, I had no idea that sound it made would stay with me for the rest of my life. When he set it down, the soft clinking inside that bag stopped my courtroom cold. And before the day was over, I would stop everything I was supposed to do and remember why justice was never meant to be blind to humanity. But before I tell you what was inside that bag and why it changed everything, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. What I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard, and I promise you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for over 40 years. My mornings start the same way they always have. I wake up early, before the city really comes alive, and I sit at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, strong, black, no sugar. My father taught me that routine keeps you grounded when life gets complicated, and I've held on to that habit ever since. My father also taught me something else. He used to say, "Frank, you can learn everything you need to know about a person by how they carry themselves when they think no one is watching." That lesson has followed me into this courtroom every single day. That morning didn't feel special at first. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:15, nodded to the officers at the door, and walked into chambers. Christina was already there, organizing files neatly on my desk. She handed me my coffee and smiled, just like she always does. I thanked her and glanced down at the docket. Traffic violations, minor offenses, a few cases with attorneys attached. One file caught my eye not because it was dramatic, but because it looked ordinary. Elderly male, fixed income, minor citation, nothing unusual on paper. By the time court began, my courtroom filled slowly. People sat with envelopes, folders, lawyers beside them. Some looked nervous, some looked irritated, some stared straight ahead like they wanted the whole thing over with as quickly as possible. Then I saw him. He was sitting near the end of the bench, closest to the aisle. He looked small in his seat, shoulders slightly hunched forward. He wore a worn jacket that looked a size too big, like it had belonged to someone else once. His shoes were clean but old, the kind you don't throw away because they still work, even when they don't look good anymore. What caught my attention wasn't just him. It was what he was holding, a thin plastic grocery bag. Not heavy, not full, just hanging from his hand like he was afraid to put it down and forget it. I could see the outline of small shapes pressing against the plastic. He kept glancing down at it, then back up toward the bench, then down again. Something about that made my chest tighten. When Christina called his case, he startled slightly, like he hadn't been expecting it. He looked around, confused for a moment, then slowly stood up. He moved carefully, each step measured, like his body didn't move as fast as his mind used to. I watched him walk toward the podium. He didn't rush. He didn't complain. He didn't look angry. He looked determined, but tired. When he reached the front, he placed the plastic bag gently on the podium. That's when I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of coins clinking together. The courtroom went silent. Not the usual silence that comes with formality. This was different. People stopped shifting in their seats. Phones were lowered. Even the air felt heavier. I leaned forward slightly. I asked him to state his name for the record. His voice was quiet but steady. He spoke carefully, like he wanted to make sure he got every word right. I asked him how he was doing that morning. He hesitated, then shrugged gently and said he was all right. Not good, not bad, just all right. That answer told me more than most explanations ever do. I glanced at the bag again. I asked him what he brought with him today. He looked down at the plastic bag, then back up at me. His hands trembled just a little as he placed both palms on the podium. He said, "I brought the money." I asked him what he meant. He swallowed hard and said he brought everything he had to pay the fine. He said he didn't want to be late again. He didn't want to owe anything. He didn't want to be a burden. That word hit me, burden. I asked him how he gathered the money. He took a breath and said he saved it, little by little, coins from groceries, change left over from the bus, a few pennies here and there from months of careful counting. He said he kept them in a jar at home and counted them every night. I could hear murmurs in the gallery. People were leaning forward now. I asked him why he didn't bring bills. He gave a small, almost apologetic smile and said he didn't really use cash like that anymore. He said most of what he had came back as change. I nodded slowly. I asked him if he knew how much the fine was. He said yes. He said he counted the coins 3 times the night before. He said he didn't sleep much because he was afraid he might be short. I felt something tighten in my chest. I looked down at the file. The amount wasn't large by most standards, but I wasn't looking at most standards. I was looking at a man who had turned survival into a nightly routine. I asked him if he lived alone. He nodded. He said his wife passed away a few years ago. He said the house felt very quiet after that. He said counting the coins gave him something to focus on. I asked him if he had help from anyone. He shook his head. He said his kids lived out of state. He said they had their own lives. He said he didn't want to bother them. That sentence sat heavy in my courtroom. I thought about my own father, about how hard it was for him to accept help, even when he needed it, about how pride can be both strength and weight. I asked the clerk to announce the amount due. When she did, the man nodded slowly and reached for the bag. His fingers moved carefully as he opened it. He poured the contents out gently onto the podium. Coins spread out in small, uneven piles. Pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters. His hands began to shake as he started counting, one by one, quietly, apologizing under his breath for taking too long. That sound of coins, one after another, echoed in my head. I looked around my courtroom and saw something I don't see often. People were uncomfortable, not annoyed, not impatient. Uncomfortable in the way you feel when you realize you're witnessing something that shouldn't be happening. I remember thinking to myself, this isn't what justice is supposed to look like. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever seen someone try to pay with everything they had, even when it cost them their dignity? If you've ever witnessed something like that, leave me a comment. And if this story is already making you feel something, hit that like button so I know you're still with me. I watched his hands shake as he counted. I watched him squint to make sure he didn't miss a coin. I watched him apologize again. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, because I realized this wasn't about a fine anymore. It was about whether I was going to let the system humiliate a man who had done nothing wrong in his heart, and what I did next would stop everything. But before I tell you that, you need to understand who this man really was and what those coins truly represented. I asked him to stop counting for just a moment, not sharply, not urgently, just gently. He froze right away, like a child afraid he'd done something wrong. His hands hovered over the coins, trembling slightly, and he looked up at me with wide, worried eyes. I told him he wasn't in trouble. I told him I just needed to ask him a few questions first. He nodded quickly and pulled his hands back, folding them together as if to keep them steady. I asked him how long he had been saving those coins. He thought for a moment, then said he wasn't exactly sure. He said it started slowly, a quarter here, a dime there. At first it was just habit. He said after his wife passed, nights got very quiet. Counting coins gave him something to do, something that made the hours pass. I felt my throat tighten as he spoke. I asked him where he kept them. He said in a glass jar on the kitchen counter, the same counter his wife used to cook on. He said every night before bed, he'd pour the coins out, count them carefully, then put them back. He said it helped him feel organized, like he was still in control of something. I nodded slowly, listening. I asked him if he ever thought about using that money for something else. Food, medicine, gas. He shook his head immediately. He said no. He said this was for the court. He said when he got the ticket, he promised himself he'd take care of it the right way. He didn't want it hanging over him. He didn't want to feel like he owed anything. That word came back again, owed. I leaned forward slightly and asked him if he understood what the ticket was for. He nodded and explained it clearly. No excuses, no blaming anyone else. He took responsibility without hesitation. That told me a lot. I asked him if he'd ever been in trouble before. He smiled softly and said no. He said this was his first time standing in front of a judge. He said he was nervous because he didn't want to mess it up. I glanced around the courtroom. People were still watching closely. No one was checking their phone now. Everyone was present. I asked him what he did for work before he retired. His face brightened just a little. He said he worked with his hands most of his life. Factory work when he was younger, maintenance later on. He said he liked fixing things. He liked knowing that when something broke, he could make it work again. That sentence sat with me. I asked him how long he'd been retired. He said he didn't really retire by choice. His body just couldn't keep up anymore. Knees, back, hands. He said things started to ache in ways they never used to. He said some mornings it hurt just to get out of bed. I asked him about his income. He said he lived on a small fixed amount every month, enough to get by if he was careful. He said he didn't complain. He said he made it work. I asked him how he felt bringing those coins into court. He hesitated. His eyes dropped to the podium. Then he looked back up at me and answered honestly. He said he felt embarrassed. He said he didn't want people to think he couldn't handle his responsibilities. He said he almost didn't come because he was afraid of being judged. That word again, judged. I looked at him and told him something important. I told him that this courtroom is not a place for shame. I told him it's a place for fairness. His eyes filled with tears, and he blinked them back quickly, apologizing again. I raised my hand gently and told him to stop apologizing. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. I thought about my own father in that moment, about how proud he was, about how hard it was for him to accept help even when he needed it. Pride can keep people standing, but it can also keep them silent. I asked him about his wife. He smiled sadly. He said she was the organized one. He said she used to tease him for leaving change in his pockets. He said if she were there, she would have had the coins wrapped neatly in paper, labeled and stacked perfectly. That small smile broke my heart. I asked him if anyone knew he was here today. He shook his head. He said he didn't tell his kids. He said he didn't want them to worry. He said they had their own families and their own problems. I could hear the room breathe collectively. I looked down at the coins again. I wasn't seeing money anymore. I was seeing time, nights alone, careful counting, pride, fear of being a burden, decades of work distilled into loose change in a plastic bag. I asked him if he needed help with anything else, transportation, groceries, medication. He shook his head and said he'd manage. He always did. That answer didn't surprise me. It rarely does. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow breath. I needed to choose my words carefully. Moments like this are delicate. Say the wrong thing, and you can make someone feel smaller. Say the right thing, and you can restore something they didn't realize they'd lost. I told him that I wanted him to know something. I told him that bringing those coins into court didn't make him weak. It made him responsible. I told him that saving slowly, patiently, night after night showed character. His eyes met mine, searching. I told him that money is not measured only by its amount. It's measured by what it costs the person who earns it. I could see people in the gallery nodding. Some wiped their eyes. I asked him how much sleep he got the night before. He chuckled softly and said not much. He said he kept recounting the coins to make sure he had enough. He said he was afraid of coming up short and disappointing the court. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. I looked at Christina briefly. She met my eyes and nodded slightly. She understood what I was feeling. I looked back at him and told him that he had done everything right. I told him he showed up. He took responsibility. He prepared the best way he knew how. I told him to leave the coins where they were for a moment. He nodded, clearly unsure what was coming next. Now let me pause here for just a second. I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone do everything they could, even when they had almost nothing to work with? If that resonates with you, leave me a comment. And if you believe dignity matters more than dollars, hit that like button so I know you're still with me. I leaned forward again and rested my hands on the bench. I told him that sometimes the law asks us to do things the same way every time, and sometimes the law asks us to stop and think about why we're doing them at all. I told him that his case had become about more than a fine. It had become about whether the system was going to recognize the human being standing in front of it. He swallowed hard and nodded. I could feel the weight of the moment settle over the room. Everyone was waiting, because what I was about to do next would either let the coins finish counting or stop them forever. And before I made that decision, I needed to say one more thing. I looked at the coins spread across the podium and then back at him. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the lights above us. Time felt slower, heavier, like everyone understood that something important was happening, even if they couldn't quite name it yet. I told him to look at me for a moment. He did, his eyes unsure, searching my face for some sign of what was coming next. I asked him a simple question. I asked him what it cost him to bring those coins here today. He seemed confused at first. He said it cost him time. He said it took him weeks to save them. He said he had to be careful not to spend too much on groceries. He said sometimes he skipped little things so he wouldn't fall short. I nodded slowly and asked him something else. I asked him what it cost him emotionally. That question stopped him. He took a breath and then let it out slowly. He said it was hard. He said it made him feel small. He said counting coins made him feel like he was standing still while the rest of the world moved on. He said he hated feeling like he was struggling when he had worked his whole life. That answer hit me right in the chest. I told him that I wanted him to understand something very clearly. I told him that the law measures fines in dollars, but it doesn't always measure cost correctly. I told him that sometimes the real cost is what it takes out of a person's dignity. I could see his eyes glisten again. He tried to blink it away, but this time he didn't apologize. He just stood there, listening. I told him that in my courtroom, responsibility matters, showing up matters, taking ownership matters, and he had done all of that. I told him that the law was satisfied long before he poured those coins out on the podium. I watched his brow furrow slightly, like he wasn't sure what I meant. I leaned forward and said something I wanted him to remember for the rest of his life. I told him that justice is not a transaction, it's a conversation, and sometimes that conversation tells us that enough is enough. I glanced at Christina again. She was watching closely, her hands folded, her eyes soft. She's seen thousands of cases with me, but moments like this never become routine. I looked back at the man and asked him if he trusted me. He hesitated, then nodded. He said yes. Quietly, carefully. I told him that I was going to ask him to do something unusual. I told him I wanted him to put the coins back in the bag. His eyes widened. He looked down at the coins, then back up at me, clearly unsure. I told him to take his time. He began to gather them slowly, carefully scooping them back into the plastic bag. Each clink echoed through the courtroom again, but this time it sounded different. Less like pressure, more like release. When he finished, he tied the bag loosely and held it close to his chest, like he was afraid someone might take it from him. I took a breath and stood up from my chair. I don't stand up often during proceedings. When I do, it's because I want people to understand that what I'm about to say matters. I told him that I had listened carefully to everything he said. I told him that I believed him. I told him that I saw the effort, the pride, and the responsibility he brought into my courtroom. Then I told him something he clearly didn't expect. I told him I was stopping the case. The words seemed to hang in the air. I told him that the fine was dismissed. For a moment he didn't react at all. His face stayed frozen, like his mind was struggling to catch up with his ears. I said it again, slowly, clearly. I told him he did not owe the court anything. His hands started to shake. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around the courtroom like he was waiting for someone to correct me. I raised my hand gently and told him to listen. I told him that no one who brings their entire savings in a plastic bag to do the right thing deserves to walk out feeling ashamed. I told him that the law is meant to correct behavior, not punish character. His eyes filled, and this time the tears fell freely. He didn't try to hide them. He stood there, overwhelmed, holding that bag of coins like it was suddenly something else entirely. I told him that he had already paid enough, not in money, in effort, in worry, in sleepless nights. I told him that in my courtroom, dignity matters more than dollars. The gallery was silent, but I could feel the emotion ripple through the room. People shifted, someone sniffled, no one spoke. I watched him slowly realize that he wasn't going to be asked for anything more. He whispered "thank you" over and over, his voice breaking each time. I told him to stop thanking me. I told him that he didn't do anything wrong. I told him that sometimes the right outcome is not collecting what the law allows, but recognizing when it's no longer just to do so. I saw him clutch the bag tighter, then slowly lower it to his side. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Do you believe the law should always take payment, no matter the cost to the person paying it? Or do you believe justice should know when to stop? Leave me a comment and tell me what you think, because I actually read them. And if this moment moved you, hit that like button so I know you're still with me. I told him he was free to go. He didn't move right away. He stood there, still trying to process what had just happened. I asked him if he was all right. He nodded and said yes. But he said he didn't know what to do with the coins now. That question broke me. I told him those coins were his. I told him to take them home. I told him to use them for groceries or save them or do whatever he felt was right. I told him that they represented his effort, and that effort was worth protecting. He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. Before he turned to leave, he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. He said that no one had ever stopped him before. He said most of his life, people just told him to keep going. I felt a tightness in my throat and nodded back at him. I watched him walk away from the podium, the plastic bag hanging from his hand, lighter now somehow, even though it weighed the same. The courtroom stayed quiet for a long moment after he left. I let that silence exist. Some moments need to settle before you move on. I eventually called the next case, but the rhythm of the day had changed. People spoke more softly. They listened more carefully. Compassion had entered the room, and it tends to linger. As the day went on, I kept thinking about the sound those coins made when they first hit the podium, how it felt like a test, not for him, for me, for the system, for whether we remember why these rules exist in the first place. That case didn't end with a receipt or a payment processed. It ended with a man walking out with his dignity intact. And what happened after that day would show me just how far that moment traveled beyond my courtroom. After he left my courtroom, the sound of those coins stayed with me. Even as I called the next case and tried to return to the rhythm of the docket, I could still hear that soft clinking in my head. It wasn't noise anymore. It was a reminder of how thin the line can be between doing what's allowed and doing what's right. I noticed something different in the room after that. People stood at the podium with a little less fear. They spoke a little more honestly. It was as if everyone had just witnessed permission being granted, permission to be human. When court recessed for a short break, I leaned back in my chair and removed my glasses. I rubbed my eyes and let out a slow breath. Christina walked over quietly and asked if I was all right. I nodded and told her I was. But the truth was, I was still thinking about him. I told her that the sound of those coins reminded me of my father, of how careful he was with money, of how every dollar represented hours of work, sweat, and pride. Christina nodded and said she felt the same way. She said the whole room felt different after that case. She was right. Later that afternoon, after court ended, I found myself replaying the moment again. The hesitation in his hands, the apology under his breath, the way he looked at me when I told him to stop counting. I wondered how many nights he'd sat alone at that kitchen counter pouring those coins out, counting and recounting them, worried about being short. That's when it hit me. That bag wasn't just full of coins. It was full of fear. Fear of disappointing the court. Fear of being seen as irresponsible. Fear of being a burden. He didn't bring that bag to court to pay a fine. He brought it to prove something. He brought it to prove he still mattered. That evening at home, my wife could tell something was on my mind. She's been able to read me for decades. Over dinner, she asked me how my day went. I told her about the man and the coins. I told her about the bag. I told her about the moment I stopped him. She listened quietly, then said something simple that stuck with me. She said, "You didn't just dismiss a fine. You protected his pride." That was exactly it. The next morning, when I arrived at the courthouse, Christina told me that people were still talking about what happened, not in a gossip way, in a reflective way. She said one woman at the clerk's window told her she'd never forget that moment. She said it made her think differently about the people she sees every day. That mattered. A few days later, something unexpected happened. I was walking down the hallway toward my chambers when I noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance. It took me a second to recognize him. He was wearing the same jacket, the same shoes, but he stood a little straighter now. It was him. He saw me and immediately looked unsure, like he wasn't sure if he should approach. I stopped and asked him how he was doing. He smiled, not nervously, not apologetically, just smiled. He told me he was doing all right. He said he went home after court and put the coins back in the jar. He said he slept better than he had in weeks. He said for the first time in a long time he didn't feel like he was falling behind. I nodded and asked him what he planned to do next. He said something that surprised me. He said he was going to take his grandson out for ice cream. He said he hadn't done that in a while because he was always worried about money. He said now he felt like he could. That stopped me. Those coins weren't just money. They were moments, ice cream, time, memories. I told him that sounded like a good plan. I told him to enjoy it. He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. For a brief second, I worried he was going to try to give me something. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. He said he wrote something down because he didn't want to forget it. He unfolded the paper and read it quietly. He said he wrote that dignity is not something you lose when you struggle. It's something you lose when no one stops to see you. I felt my throat tighten. I nodded and thanked him for sharing that with me. After he left, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary. That hallway felt different now, too. Over the next few weeks, I noticed how often people came into my courtroom carrying invisible bags. Some filled with fear, some with shame, some with exhaustion. Not everyone had coins clinking inside, but everyone had something weighing them down. I found myself asking different questions, not just what happened, but how are you doing? Not just why you're here, but what brought you here. People responded to that. Now let me pause here for just a second. I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where someone stopped you, really saw you, and changed how you felt about yourself? If you have, leave me a comment and tell me about it. And if this story is still resonating with you, hit that like button so I know you're with me. A few weeks later, Christina told me that the man had stopped by again. This time he wasn't nervous. He wasn't unsure. He just wanted to drop off a note. He didn't ask to see me. He didn't want to interrupt. The note was short. He wrote that he wanted me to know he was doing okay. He wrote that he was being more careful with himself now. He wrote that he realized he didn't have to prove his worth by suffering quietly. That sentence stayed with me. I put the note in my desk drawer with others like it, not as reminders of what I did, but of what listening can do. I thought again about my father, about how he believed that a system only works if people trust it. And trust is built in moments like that, quiet moments, human moments. That elderly man came into my courtroom thinking he had to pay with everything he had. He left knowing that sometimes the most valuable thing you can receive is not relief from a fine, but relief from shame. That realization changed the way I carried myself on this bench. It reminded me that justice isn't measured by how efficiently we collect payments. It's measured by how people walk out the door. And as I reflected on all of that, I realized there was still one more part of this story. One final moment that showed me just how far that simple act of stopping him traveled beyond that day. Time has a way of revealing what really matters. Days pass, then weeks, in most cases fade into the background. Files get closed, names blur together, but every now and then a moment refuses to disappear. It keeps resurfacing, quietly reminding you that something important happened. That elderly man and his bag of coins became one of those moments for me. Weeks after that day, I found myself thinking about him during the smallest things. When I paid for my coffee, when I dropped loose change into my pocket without thinking, when I watched someone at the grocery store carefully count out bills at the register. Every time I heard coins clink together, my mind went back to that podium. One afternoon, Christina came into my chambers holding another small envelope. She didn't say anything at first. She just placed it gently on my desk, like she understood it carried weight. She told me the man had come by again. Not for court, not because he had to. He just wanted to leave something behind. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a handwritten note written carefully, almost like each word had been measured the same way he measured his coins. He wrote that he had thought a lot about that day. He said he realized something he had never allowed himself to believe before. He wrote that asking for fairness is not the same as asking for charity. That sentence stopped me. He wrote that after leaving court, he walked home instead of taking the bus. He said the walk felt different, lighter. He said he wasn't hunched over anymore. He said people looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he needed to look away. He wrote that he took his grandson out for ice cream, just like he said he would. He described the way his grandson smiled when he ordered 2 scoops instead of 1. He said he hadn't realized how much he'd been depriving himself of small joys out of fear. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. That fine wasn't just money, it was a wall between him and life. Christina told me something else after I finished reading. She said the man had stayed for a while in the hallway, sitting quietly on a bench. He watched people come and go. She said he told her he wanted to see how a courthouse worked when he wasn't afraid of it. That thought struck me deeply. How many people see places like this only through fear? A month later, I saw him again myself. It was late morning and court had just recessed. I was walking through the lobby when I noticed him standing near the bulletin board, reading notices carefully. This time, he wasn't holding a plastic bag. He had his hands folded behind his back, relaxed. I walked over and asked him how he was doing. He smiled and said he was good. Not just all right this time, good. He told me he'd started volunteering a few hours a week at a local community center. Nothing official, just helping set up chairs, sweeping floors, fixing things when they broke. He said it felt good to be useful again. He said fixing things was what he'd always been good at. I nodded and told him that sounded like him. He said something then that caught me off guard. He said when he volunteered, people didn't ask him about his past or his money. They just thanked him. He said being thanked meant more to him than he expected. I thought about that as he spoke. We live in a world that measures people by what they produce, what they earn, what they can give financially. But sometimes what people need most is to feel needed. He told me he still kept the coins in the jar. He said he hadn't spent them yet. He said they reminded him of something important. He said they reminded him that he didn't fail. He said he just reached a moment where he needed understanding. I could hear the pride in his voice now. Not loud pride, quiet pride, the kind that settles into your bones. Now let me pause here for just a second. I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where someone treated you with fairness instead of judgment, and it changed how you saw yourself? If you have, tell me about it in the comments. And if you're still with me in this story, hit that like button so I know you're here. As more time passed, I started noticing changes beyond just him. Other people began bringing notes, not to me directly, but to the clerk's office. Short messages about how they felt heard, how they felt respected, how one moment in court made them rethink something about themselves. I don't share those notes publicly. I keep them private. They're not trophies, they're reminders. Reminders that every case carries weight far beyond the paper it's written on. One morning, a man stood at the podium, clearly nervous. His hands shook. His voice wavered. I saw the fear immediately, the kind of fear that says, I don't belong here. Without even thinking about it, I slowed down. I asked him to take a breath. I explained things carefully. I made sure he understood before moving on. After court, Christina told me that man had stayed behind. He asked her if this was the same courtroom where the elderly man brought coins in a plastic bag. That surprised me. She told him yes. She said he nodded and said he felt calmer knowing that. He considered it a place where people were treated fairly. That's when I understood something important. Stories travel, moments travel. The way we treat one person becomes the reputation of a system. That day with the coins wasn't just about one man. It became a reference point, a story people told themselves when they walked into a place that usually scares them. I thought about how easily that story could have gone the other way, how easily it could have ended with humiliation instead of dignity, how small the difference was between those two outcomes. I went home that night and told my wife about all of it, about the note, about the volunteering, about the ripple effect. She listened quietly, then said something that felt exactly right. She said, "You didn't just stop him from paying, you stopped him from shrinking." That stayed with me. I realized then that dignity isn't something you give people. It's something you protect when it's under threat. That man didn't come into my courtroom asking for mercy. He came asking to do the right thing. All I did was make sure the system didn't punish him for it. And that's when it became clear to me. Justice doesn't always announce itself with a ruling. Sometimes it whispers, and if you're paying attention, you hear it. And there was still one more moment left in this story. One final chapter that brought everything together and reminded me why, even after all these years, I still believe deeply in this work. As more time went on, I realized that the real impact of that day wasn't measured in what changed for him alone. It showed itself in how it changed the way I listened, the way I paused, and the way I saw the people who came into my courtroom carrying burdens you can't see on a docket sheet. After 40 years, it's easy to think you've seen it all. You learn the patterns, you anticipate the excuses, you recognize the usual rhythms of regret and responsibility. But that elderly man reminded me that there are still stories that don't fit into patterns, stories that ask you to slow down instead of moving on. I started noticing how many people came into my courtroom already apologizing before they spoke. They apologized for being nervous. They apologized for not understanding. They apologized for taking up time. It struck me how often people believe they need to apologize simply for existing in a space of authority. That thought bothered me more than I expected. One morning, a woman stood at the podium clutching a stack of papers, her hands shaking. She kept saying she was sorry for bothering the court. I thought of the man with the coins, of how many times he apologized just for counting. I stopped her gently and told her she wasn't a bother. I told her that court exists for people, not the other way around. I saw her shoulders relax. That's when I understood that what happened with the coins had quietly reset something in me. It reminded me that justice doesn't lose strength when it shows patience. It gains credibility. Weeks later, I received a call from a local senior center. They didn't ask for anything. They just wanted to share a story. They told me about an older gentleman who had been talking to others about a moment in court that changed how he saw himself. They didn't use his name, but I knew exactly who they meant. They said he spoke about dignity, about how the system didn't shame him when he expected it to, about how being treated with respect made him feel like he still belonged in the world. I sat quietly after that call ended. I thought about how many seniors live quietly on the edge of embarrassment, fixed incomes, physical limitations, pride that keeps them from asking for help. They've spent their lives contributing and now they feel invisible. That realization weighed on me. I thought about my own father again, about how hard it was for him to slow down, about how much he valued self-reliance, about how deeply he feared becoming a burden. I wondered how he would have felt standing at that podium with a bag of coins. That thought made my decision that day feel even more necessary. I began to speak more openly from the bench about dignity, not in lectures, not in speeches, just in small reminders. I told people that showing up matters, that effort matters, that character isn't measured by bank accounts. I saw the effect. People stopped rushing through explanations. They stopped panicking as much. They asked questions instead of shutting down. The courtroom felt less like a place of fear and more like a place of resolution. One afternoon during a recess, Christina and I talked about it quietly. She told me she'd noticed the difference too. She said people lingered less angrily now. They left calmer. She said they felt heard, even when the outcome wasn't what they hoped for. That's the part people don't talk about. You don't have to win to feel respected. I saw the elderly man one more time later that year. It was just before the holidays. I was leaving the courthouse when I noticed him standing outside, holding the door open for people as they came and went. He wasn't doing it for attention. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just being helpful. When he saw me, he smiled and nodded. I nodded back. I asked him how he was doing. He said he was doing well. He said he'd started coming by once in a while to help people who looked confused. He said sometimes all they needed was directions. Sometimes they just needed someone to talk to while they waited. He told me he still had the jar of coins at home. He said he hadn't spent them. He said they reminded him of a turning point, not a punishment avoided, but a moment where someone stopped and listened. I asked him if he ever felt embarrassed about that day anymore. He shook his head and said no. He said it used to bother him, but now it made him proud. He said it reminded him that he did the right thing, even when it was hard. That answer meant everything to me. As we spoke, I noticed something else. People passing by nodded to him. Some said hello. He belonged there now, not as a defendant, as a presence. After he left, I stood there for a moment thinking about how rare that transformation is. Not because people can't change, but because systems don't often give them the space to. That's when it really sank in. The most powerful thing I did that day wasn't dismissing the fine. It was stopping the process long enough to see the person. I thought about how easily that moment could have gone unnoticed, how easily the coins could have been collected, the receipt printed, the case closed. The system would have functioned perfectly, and something human would have been lost. Instead, the system paused, and in that pause, dignity survived. I started to realize that moments like that don't just change outcomes, they change narratives. They give people a story about themselves that isn't rooted in failure. That elderly man no longer told himself he was someone who struggled to pay a fine. He told himself he was someone who did the right thing and was treated fairly for it. That matters more than people realize. Now let me pause here for just a second. I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where someone stopped what they were doing and really saw you, and it changed how you carried yourself afterward? If that's happened to you, leave me a comment and tell me about it. And if you're still with me, hit that like button so I know you're here. As I reflect on all of this, I'm reminded why I've stayed on this bench for so long. It's not for the authority. It's not for the routine. It's for the moments when justice becomes personal. The law will always exist. Rules will always exist. But compassion is a choice we make over and over again. That man with the coins reminded me that justice isn't measured by how efficiently we process cases. It's measured by how people walk away from them. And as this story comes to its close, there's one final reflection I want to share with you. One truth that ties all of this together and explains why that bag of coins will always stay with me. I think about that plastic bag of coins more often than I ever expected to. Not because of what was inside it, but because of what it represented. After more than 40 years on this bench, I've learned that justice doesn't come down to numbers. It comes down to moments. And that day, when an elderly man stood in front of me with his life reduced to loose change in a grocery bag, was one of those moments that stays with you forever. When he walked into my courtroom, he didn't come asking for mercy. He didn't come asking for favors. He came asking to do the right thing. That matters. In a world where people are often trying to escape responsibility, he walked in carrying it, literally in his hands. Those coins weren't just money. They were nights alone at a kitchen counter. They were careful decisions at the grocery store. They were pride, fear, discipline, and dignity, all mixed together. They were proof that even when someone has very little, they can still have character. My father used to tell me something when I was young. He said, "Frank, the true test of fairness isn't how you treat someone when it's easy. It's how you treat them when the rules give you power over them." That lesson echoed in my mind that day as I watched that man's hands shake while counting coins. I realized something important in that moment. The law gave me the right to take his money, but justice gave me the responsibility to stop and ask whether I should. Stopping him wasn't about being generous. It wasn't about being kind for the sake of kindness. It was about recognizing that the system was on the verge of taking something it had no right to take, his dignity. When I told him to stop counting, I didn't just stop a payment. I stopped a moment that could have broken him, and when I dismissed everything, I wasn't dismissing the law. I was honoring its purpose. Over the years, I've seen people leave my courtroom angry, relieved, confused, grateful, and sometimes ashamed. But I'll never forget the way he left. He walked out lighter, not because he had more money, but because he no longer felt small. That's something the law should always strive for. People should leave understanding what happened, but they should never leave feeling less than human. I think about him every time I hear coins clink together now. I think about how easily that sound could have meant humiliation instead of hope. And I think about how thin the line is between justice and cruelty when we stop paying attention. That day also reminded me of something else. Aging in this country can be lonely. Pride can become a prison. People who work their entire lives can suddenly find themselves afraid of being seen as a burden. And when that fear meets a system that doesn't slow down, it can be devastating. But when the system pauses, even briefly, something powerful happens. Trust is built. That man trusted the court enough to bring everything he had. And because of that trust, the court owed him more than a receipt. It owed him respect. After 40 years, I still believe the law is the great equalizer. But I've also learned that equality doesn't mean sameness. It means fairness. It means understanding the weight behind what someone brings with them. Coins from a plastic bag don't weigh the same as bills from a wallet. Not emotionally, not morally, not humanly. I've been asked before why moments like this matter so much to me. Why I remember them when there are thousands of other cases. The answer is simple. These moments show us who we are when no one is forcing us to care. That elderly man didn't walk away with a victory. He walked away with his self-respect intact. And in my experience, that's worth more than any fine the court could ever collect. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was right to stop him and dismiss everything? Or do you think the law should have taken the money because the rule allowed it? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were sitting where I sit, watching an elderly man count coins one by one just to do the right thing, what would you have done? Would you have let the system finish its process, or would you have stepped in? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that dignity still matters, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Someone who believes that character matters more than cash. Someone who needs a reminder that doing the right thing still counts. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, young or old, rich or struggling. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember this. Respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.